Well, thank you, Anthony, very much for a very, very clear exposition of exactly what's at stake here. We've now got time for questions from the audience, and also we're happy to take questions from those people listening online if you want to send them in. There's a Twitter hashtag, or I think you can find other ways. How else do we send them in? Somebody tell me, how else do they send online questions in? Is it by Twitter? Okay, there's the Twitter hashtag down there. We'll collect those up in a little while. But let's take a question from the audience first of all. Does somebody want to kick off? Yes, at the back there. Can you just wait for the microphone so that the people online can hear?
It's for the online. Yes, of course.
Hugh Lloyd. My question is, what do you think the risk or prospect of fire sales in these markets might be, either in terms of assets or fundamental resources?
Well, I mean, it could be a very real risk. I mean, we've seen, we've probably got a very live example going on with tar sands at the moment, where I think it's becoming clear to everybody that tar sands is no longer economic. So, we've already seen a number of assets being sold in Canada as a result. And particularly, the problem arises, the risk of stranded assets is not the currently producing reserves. And I'm talking about oil and gas. I think coal is a different proposition. I'll talk about that in a second. It's all of these future reserves that are being opened up now that would need a producing life of 20, 30, 40 years. That's where the risk of stranded assets lies, and that they could be the subject of future fire sales. Coal is clear we don't need any more coal. We have an overcapacity of coal. There was a overinvestment in supply during the height of the commodity super cycle. Yet there are plans out there, as we all know, to try and build more coal mines. But those are only going to get built if they're heavily subsidised and backed by governments. There is no way the financial markets would fund those, because the financial markets can see that new coal mines don't make financial sense. So yes, like in any industry that's in trouble and is struggling, there is a risk. Now, of course, we to some degree seeing that with the bankruptcies of US coal companies, because a lot of them are emerging from Chapter 11, shorn of many of the liabilities for clean-up and the debts and so on, so they can go on now producing coal unhindered by all of the debts and liabilities they built up, and that is a problem. But again, the hope is that it still doesn't get them out of the fact that they're now in competition with clean energy to supply energy, and that clean energy is becoming ever cheaper and more abundant. And we haven't even yet had the big breakthrough on storage, which will, the scale up and the dramatic fall in cost has transformed things. Just wait for when storage comes online at scale.
Let's take a question down here, and then we'll go over to that side.
So I am Marcel, I'm from Zero Carbon Cambridge, and we're a student group who we're calling the university to divest their endowment fund. So we submitted a grace to Regent House, and it's passed. So we have a democratic decision by the academics and the students that the university shall divest. But the council is calling on their fiduciary responsibility to oppose that decision. Can you tell us if it's financially responsible to divest from fossil fuels or not as a university? Thank you.
Well, if you're invested and you understand the risks of climate change, let's start with that. You have to do, in our view, you have to do something. Yes, for moral and ethical reasons, but even more importantly, it goes to the fiduciary point, for financial reasons. Because if you are not assessing the financial risks of this transition, then you are almost certainly in breach of your fiduciary duties. And there's a piece of analysis from the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment. They did a lot of work with a lot of legal analysis on fiduciary duty that makes this very clear. So to simply say, which is, oh, we can't divest because these are good investments, and actually not test that, that is reckless. And in my view, and I think increasing the view, is that is a breach of fiduciary duty. Now, and a lot of funds, as you know, because of what's happened with share prices of energy companies, particularly for coal, that have divested, they've done better because they haven't been exposed to the collapse in the value of the shares of pure coal plays, and to some degree, oil and gas. But of course, those oil prices will still come up, so those share prices for oil and gas and so on will still come up. So you don't want to argue just on that alone. Now, so it's tricky for us because we don't, as an organisation, or even though our analysis on burnable carbon, stranded assets analysis, was the spark for the divestment movement, and was picked up by, it was our original report picked up by Bill McKibben, who did that brilliant piece of writing, which if you haven't read it, you should read, Global Warming, Terrifying New Math, in Rolling Stones magazine. It's a brilliant piece of writing, and that the obscure group of analysts he refers to as Carbon Tracker. The divestment movement is brilliant, is fantastic in terms of mobilising grassroots, putting pressure, bringing this issue up, and it's a very simple concept to understand. And if you are able to divest, then I think you should, because that sends a very important message. But the problem is the vast majority of the financial markets will not be able to divest, and of course the other problem is you divest, someone else just picks up the shares, who maybe has less, who cares less about this than you, some sort of hedge fund or whatever that doesn't really care. So the other thing, if you're not going to divest, then you must engage. You must engage with these companies and use your power as a shareholder to go in and say, what are you guys doing? How are you managing the climate risk? You have got to put yourselves on a 2 degrees pathway, because if you don't, you're going to destroy the value of our investment in you. In our view, my answer to your question is divest or engage, and do not ignore the risk, because if you're ignoring the risk, then I think there's a strong case that that's a breach of fiduciary duty. And you should send, if they haven't already seen it, should make sure that they read the PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment piece on fiduciary duty in this context.
Thank you very much, by the way, for all the stuff you've given us, which is very encouraging, right? But just 2 quick points. The 2 degrees, a number of environmental groups in Cambridge over the last 10 years have often complained that perhaps that was a great mistake from the scientific world. It just wasn't the right level. It was unrealistic. In fact, anything just over that means the planet will fry. It's already started to fry, as you know, in India and in Australia. That's the first point. The other point is, while all your technological stuff is wonderful to hear, and it's the ultimate result, I wonder how you look at the depth of the resistance right now in America, for instance, with Trump and the oil and the coal industry and the hijacking of the finances away from all the environmental projects and that shower of troglodytes he's got around him, and the effect on the American public, on the whole global warming issue. That's what worries me, the depth of the resistance, to the obvious need for the change.
Well, okay, I think I detect two questions in there. One's a scientific question. I'm not really, even though I have a science background, best qualified person to answer that. But as a as a non-practicing scientist, anecdotally, yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot out there that suggests that even 2 degrees is too dangerous. But tell you, when you go out into the financial markets and business, people go, oh, 2 degrees, that's far too difficult. 3 or 3.5, and you just go, you have no idea what you're talking about, do you? 2.5, 3. Again, the evidence out there is that would be catastrophic. 2 degrees will be massively dangerous. And don't forget, a lot of our work in the IA and everyone else is based on a 50% probability. So it's like playing Russian roulette with, half the bullets in and half the bullets out of the chamber. There's more and more calls for either 2 degrees with a higher probability of 66% probability, and there's an 80% probability budget out there. But the problem is we've used much of that up. Because 1.5 degrees is mentioned, obviously 2 degrees with efforts to go beyond 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement, more and more people are calling for 1.5 degrees, and there will be a number of 1.5 degrees scenarios and budgets coming out this year. IEA are doing theirs for energy in June. But what you find with those is we're almost there. So the 1.5 degrees at an 80% probability, we've probably used that up. 1.5 degrees with a 50% probability, we may have a few years left. You'd have to start now, and you'd have to start with massive amounts of negative emissions. So yeah, I agree. 2 degrees probably will be disastrous. But 2.5 and 3 degrees will be catastrophic. Your second question, Trump. Yeah, but okay, 2 responses. We're opening our New York office at the moment, and we will double down on the financial analysis. We will be out there. I don't think we need to talk about climate or 2 degrees. We'll be talking about the energy transition and the technology transition, and the fact that a US president can no more stop this technological transition that's happening because it just is cheaper. It's the new technology than a US president could have stopped the transition from fixed line telephones to mobile telephones, or from the steam locomotive to the automobiles. The market will drive this because it is the better technological solution, and it will be cheaper, is cheaper.
Sort of slightly following on from that, I'm interested in what you think about the carbon fee and dividend proposal that is being taken up by some of the Republicans in the States, which I think is based on the British Columbia carbon tax system that they've had for a number of years. And one of the things that surprised me was that some of the nominally Green groups and Democrat groups seem to be opposing it on the basis that it's where the money would be spent wouldn't be sufficiently green. I wondered what you thought about it. Is it a good solution?
Well, I would want to look under the bonnet and really understand why they are suggesting this. Is it simply just as a way to make it politically easier to scrap a lot of environmental regulations and protections? That would be my concern. But with a carbon markets background, I do believe that the most efficient, cost-effective solution at the end of the day is they put a price on it. But it has to be a realistic price. As you saw from my presentation, the good news is, because the technological solutions have come down in cost so much, that price is not what it doesn't need to be what it once needed to be. Probably $50 a tonne, certainly in the energy sector. So that's the good news. And if you put a price on it, I've been there, I've been in the carbon markets, the entrepreneurial energy that is unleashed. The human beings are, when there's a value to capture, human beings are incredibly innovative, driven, and entrepreneurial. and they'll find ways, I mean, the technological transition we're seeing is evidence of that. The cost of this stuff is coming down so much faster. The technological solutions that are being developed are helping us get there. But we've got to remember, there's a race against that clock to do this and keep within the budget. I mean, that is critical.
I'm going to turn now to James, who's going to tell us about some of the online questions that we're having.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a question here from Laura, who's from New York. She says, what is preventing the repricing of oil companies, and what will be the tipping point?
What's preventing the repricing of oil companies? Well, I mean, the markets have been repricing them. I mean, the share prices with the low oil environment have been going down. I always think that the financial markets are not as efficient. This film and what happened in the financial crisis is a good example of that. The information is out there, but there's always a delay in people getting that information and understanding what it means. Which is why, this has been recognised by Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, and the Financial Stability Board task force, which is why they've worked so hard over the last year to come up with a set of recommendations on disclosure of financial risk from climate and the energy transition, or the transition. That is what I think is critical, because if those recommendations are adopted and sufficiently robustly, then you'll get disclosure of the right information in the right form to the markets, which will allow shareholders and investors to properly price this risk, what we call in Carbon Tracker and in many of our reports, the fossil fuel risk premium. Because I think there's another analogy for you. I don't know, I meant some of you are probably too young, but not everybody here. So you may remember the Roadrunner. Do you remember those Roadrunner cartoons? And the little cartoon character, I think was it Roadrunner, who runs off the cliff, and it takes him a little bit of time to realise that he's run out of ground, and he sort of keeps running for a while until he looks down and goes, and then he drops like a stone. Well, I often think the financial markets are a little bit like that. And 99% of them just herd mentality, and they continue, and as long as they're all together doing the same direction, doesn't matter what's changed in the world or fundamentals. Oh, look, everyone else is doing this. Oh yeah, I'm still within that group. Okay, I'm still in this group. And then the difference is they just all fall together. But at least they fall together. So that's why I think the FSB is so important in terms of ensuring the markets and all of us get that information to properly understand this risk and what it means for these companies. Then it'll be possible to correctly price that into them.
Shall I ask another one from the web?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So this is from Adrienne from Canada, from Ottawa. And she says, The Economist this week reported clean energy's rapid rise disrupting electricity systems. And could this dampen the growth of renewables? So failure of the So it's the failure of the electricity system to keep up with the rise of renewables, so the grid and that sort of.
Yeah, well, so again, quite a technical question. We're financial analysts, but I'll do my best. Look, a lot of when you have any technological transition, what happens is it's not just one piece of technology. And I did a lot of reading to understand these sort of transitions into the automobile. And the automobile took 30 plus years before it got to that tipping point. And actually, there were three competing technologies, which no one really... There was electric vehicles, liquid fuel vehicles, obviously the modern combustion engine, and gas. And it wasn't clear for 20 years which technology was going to win out. But it was, it was a number of things coming together. Rubber tires, ignition systems, steering systems, suspension, and a whole range of other things before, and some policy. What really, caused it to take off was the US federal government spending huge amounts of money on an interstate system and providing the roads. And you know, strategically, governments deciding they needed oil for their navies to fire for their ships, so they kind of backed a lot of the rollout of petrol stations and supply. And it was all those different components coming together that caused the takeoff. Now, what we've got at the moment is we've had massive jumps forward in the generation technology, solar and wind, but probably not as much in the transition technology, and particularly storage. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the support mechanisms, feed-in tariffs and so on, and tax credits and all the rest of it, you know, that supported renewables, were all focused on the generation and not on those other technologies. So those got a lot of support and to both develop and commercialize, whereas a lot of the other technology needed in the grids and storage didn't. But that's now been recognised. There's a lot of government R&D going in to those other technologies. So we will get to a point where enough of those technologies come together that it just goes off like that. You know, and of course the one everyone talks about is storage.
Okay, let's take a question down here at the front, and then we'll come to you at the back.
So we have the $50 per tonne charge. Who gets that money?
We're incredibly ingenious at how we develop anything. I mean, we could decide anybody gets it. So, I mean, the Republican suggestion that was mentioned earlier in the US is quite interesting because that money would be rebated back to ordinary taxpayers, which I guess, you know, is a calculation to make it attractive to your average Republican voter. But my guess, so you take the UK as an example where we've got the floor price, the Treasury gets that. And when there was a proposal to actually scrap the floor price from industry and from sort of some sort of right-wing politicians, the Treasury were like, we're dependent on that now. But I mean, it goes back to basic, discussions about transforming the tax system to basically put a cost on bads and remove the tax from goods. I mean, if you were to really sit down and you could do it with a blank sheet of paper and be really logical about it, you'd go, well, okay, well, what's good? Well, people working is good, so let's reduce income tax. So we want people to work more and get more of the money. But actually, instead, we'll raise the tax on things like carbon emissions to compensate. So the Treasury and governments, they don't lose any money, but it's just, the things that are priced through taxation are the things that are bad, and the things that are good, like working and employment, are not taxed. But I mean, come up with any number of solutions. You could decide to give it to Battersea Dogs Home if you really wanted, but that's highly unlikely. My guess is that as governments start to get carbon taxes come in, it'll go like all taxes to central government coffers. I mean, there will be some debate around hypothecation, which means saying you should put this tax towards a specific purpose, and there'll be a lot of argument about, well, actually, carbon tax or green tax should go towards funding clean energy and renewables. But I mean, that will, it'll be a policy question, it'll be a political question, and that I would imagine finance ministers and treasuries around the world will have a big say in where that money goes.
Yep.
Fantastic lecture, much to digest. You haven't said much about nuclear. Why?
Well, we don't really analyse nuclear. No, I mean, we don't particularly analyse nuclear. Our focus is on fossil fuels. We look at it in the overall cost, and, it's very expensive. So it's not a cheap option to build new new nuclear-powered stations. And when you've got a new technology that is very cheap, and of course doesn't have the sort of waste issues that you get with nuclear. But, maybe say something controversial. If we didn't have clean energy and renewables, and it was, and the clean energy and renewables had not developed and scaled up at the speed and scale at which they are, we didn't have that as an option, and it was a choice between nuclear and runaway climate change, I'd probably pick nuclear. Because at least you live another day, or live to fight another day and deal with the nuclear waste. Whereas if you have runaway climate change, you don't live to fight another day. But luckily, I think our technological innovation is getting us out of that quandary.
So I'm going to ask one question, and then I'll take a final question from the audience. So if you've got a final question you want to, then you need to raise your hand. A question I was going to ask, so you made a slightly provocative comment about carbon capture and storage, saying that your analysis suggested that carbon capture and storage was going to be leapfrogged as a technology, and that efforts to get it off the ground were wasted at the moment.
Yeah.
You really stand by that, do you? You think that even for baseload, it's going to... You did this, I didn't look in detail. You flashed up your graphs too quickly for me to look in detail at the energy mix that you were proposing.
No, CCS post-2050 for a number of industrial uses, yes. Because we still can't see, a technological solution. But 30 years we might have by then. But at the moment, no one can really see a way around carbon capture and storage for, a series of industrial processes. But they don't have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. The energy sector does, and it's the biggest contributor. It's too late in many respects. And also, when you actually look at the numbers for CCS, it is nowhere near a silver bullet. So the IEA's idealised, so I'm going to do this from memory. Probably someone will come back and say, you got that number wrong. But from memory, the IEA's idealised scenario is 3,800 commercially operating CCS facilities by 2050. So I should step back. The problem we've got here is on all pathways, we're going to need negative emissions. And negative emissions means we're going to have to capture CO2 and we're going to have to sequester it. I put it somewhere. And so CCS, carbon capture and storage, is where you're capturing the carbon released when you burn a fossil fuel like coal, and then you liquefy it or you put it through various processes, and then you put it down deep into the rocks. So you sequester it. But that's an incredibly expensive process. And we still, despite years of trying to do so with government support and various collaborations and government subsidies, we still don't have one commercial scale operating CCS facility. We have about 15 pilot schemes around the world. We haven't got one off the ground in the UK. But the IEA's, International Energy Authority's, idealised scenario is 3,800 by 2050. So that's a key part of us getting on a 2 degrees pathway. 3,800. I'm sure there's some mathematicians here who can work out how many hundred that is a year between now and 2050. And these things are going to cost billions. And we haven't yet got one that's commercial scale, proven commercially. And even if we do that, the 3,800, that's only 14% of the carbon budget that buys you another 14 years. So you're going to spend trillions on this, and you still are only buying yourself another 14% of the carbon budget. But let you into a little secret here. Nature spent millions and millions of years working on its own carbon capture and storage. Do you want to know what that's called? Trees. You could probably spend a fraction to get the same amount of carbon captured on just saving our rainforests and actually expanding them again, so moving them from net emitters, which they are at the moment because of deforestation, to actually be in major global sinks, sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere and buying us a bit more carbon budget as we transition to clean technology. Yet all this energy and focus from the oil, gas and coal companies and governments is on CCS. It's like, duh. Nature spent millions of years developing the technology we need, but no, it wasn't man-made. We have to go and build these great big industrial CCS facilities. Doesn't make sense, but anyway.
Final question.
What could be a 5-point, 3-point action plan for a coal company not to become the next Kodak?
A coal company. Well, the diversified mining companies, actually, they've been quite smart because for the last 10 years, they've been, quietly divesting themselves of their most expensive coal. And making investments in a lot of the minerals we're going to need for batteries and solar and so on. So actually, they've been quite smart about it. Sole play coal companies like Peabody haven't really had much of a choice, unless you're just simply going to wholesale go, well, I'm going to stop doing coal in 10 years, and I'm going to start, growing and selling tulips. It's a bit difficult. And it's, to be fair to these companies, it's quite difficult to go and convince your shareholders that, they're like, well, you're a coal company, that's why I put my money into you. You want to do what? You want to learn how to grow tulips? It's quite difficult for them. But if you put a company into run on, it's difficult for management. Why would you, if you're sort of the upcoming CEO, you spent 20, 30 years of your career fighting your way up, you don't want to be running a company that's going ex-growth and in decline. You want, like all those other CEOs, to be going out and doing a big project in the Arctic and, expanding the company and building the reserves. And then suddenly to be told, well, you've made CEO, but you've now got to manage the decline of Shell or Chevron or Exxon. That's not what that guy spent 30 years clawing his way up the corporate pole to do. So it's a very difficult sell. And maybe the guys running these companies are not the right people anymore because they have a certain mindset and they're finding it very difficult to shift that. And the same with the board members. That's why there's a lot of campaigns to get climate qualified board members onto the boards of these major companies. And increasingly a lot of pressure for us and others via the shareholders to sort of get people into the executive positions in those companies who understand how to run a company, probably people who used to run utilities or similar companies. Because they can make a lot of money from their, selling the oil, gas and coal that we do need over 30 years, just not then taking the revenues from currently producing oil, gas and coal and punting it up the cost curve into ever more expensive oil, gas and coal projects and destroying value. And the other big debate, which is kind of personal to your question, is could they transition to clean energy companies? Some of them are making valiant efforts. So at the progressive end, Total and Statoil and Eni in Italy and so on, making massive investments. But they're still very wedded to the fossil fuel side. I'm not necessarily shrinking that. They probably left it too late. And what will happen is, as in any technological transition, is eventually they'll be beaten by the new nimble companies who will become the big energy companies of the future. Or the Googles and Apples who are also eyeing energy and how they could supply that in the future and play a big role in energy. Because I think one thing is clear, the Internet of Things will play a big role in how we use and efficiently use energy and resources in the future. And I think the big technology companies in Silicon Valley can see that.
Well, thank you, Anthony, for a very insightful talk and a response to various questions that we've had this evening. I know that you say that you feel that your role is to speak the language of financial markets to those people in the financial markets, but I think you've demonstrated this evening that speaking that language is also a powerful case for action more generally, actually.
Well, I think you've got to make a financial case. You're not going to get into BlackRock or, any of the big pension funds or asset managers or investment banks, but as right as it is, by saying this is a massive existential problem, it's a massive challenge to our civilization, to get in the door and have a conversation with those guys, you've got to have a very strong financial case. And you've got to go in there saying, look, we've got some analysis that demonstrates that if these companies do X, Y, Z, they're going to destroy value. And that's going to be bad for you and your investments. You've got to have a strong financial case.
So perhaps I can ask everyone to join me in thanking you very much for a very